Thank you very much. With this cool podium and this flashing thing on my chest, I feel like I'm in the Starship Enterprise. Where's Spock? Where's Scotty? We need to go faster. I had a tour of the library facility here before the event tonight, and I was just amazed. Now, I've seen a lot of libraries across the United States and in other countries as well. This is just a tremendous facility. I told Barbara that this should be the model for library building across the United States. It has everything you would want here. It has warmth and size and spaciousness and all the high-tech stuff, but it has a feeling of community that is just amazing. And when I also heard it was built with private dollars, that's just, wow. Particularly these days, it's really tough to do. And the community is the winner for having a facility like this, and you certainly had a lot of insight and foresight to build a place where the town can come and enjoy and be surrounded by books and ideas, and I applaud you for doing that. It's interesting. I was a trial lawyer for almost 10 years, and I've argued cases in state and federal court across the United States. I've given speeches across the country and in other countries as well. With presidents and former presidents and Supreme Court justices, and very important muckety-mucks are sitting in the audience, and I enjoy public speaking for the most part. But about 11 years ago, I accepted a speaking engagement, and quite frankly, as soon as I accepted it, I regretted it, because even for me, it was a little bit too much pressure. And as the days grew closer for me to go to this event, I became more and more irritable and morose and just unpleasant person to be around, as my wife will tell you. And finally, the day came for me to go to this event. And I woke up, and after much soul-searching and having thought about the fact that I had committed to go to this event, I turned to my wife and I said, "Can you just call them and tell them I'm dangerously ill?" Well, instead of calling anyone, my wife being my wife, she sort of grabbed me and pulled me close and said, "Look, buddy, you're going to go to your daughter's kindergarten class. And you're going to talk to the 5-year-olds. Now, being a very strong, independent male myself, I did exactly as my wife said. It was Parents' Career Week at my kids' school, and this is when moms and dads go in and they talk to the kids about what they do for a living. Now, my dilemma had been exacerbated by the fact that my daughter had come home the day before I was scheduled to appear at the school, as excited as I'd ever seen her. And she said, "Dad, today was the greatest day ever in my kindergarten career." I said, "Really, why was that?" She said, "Well, Tommy's mom came in today, and Tommy's mom is a marine biologist. I don't know what that means, Dad, but she brought live fish." It was so cool. And then my daughter looked at me and said, "What are you going to do?" Because see, until my daughter was about 9 years old, if you asked her what her dad did for a living, she wouldn't say that I wrote books. She would say, "My dad signs his names in books, and people buy them because he has great handwriting." So then my daughter looked at me again and said, "Dad, you can't write in the books at school. You'll get a timeout." So she was very upset about what I was going to do at kindergarten. Well, what I did was I took two things with me. One was a movie poster from Absolute Power. Not that these kids would have seen an R-rated movie, but I wanted to talk to them about how you turn books into pictures and things like that. And I also took with me what I turned my ace in the hole in case things went to hell fast in kindergarten. I took a stack of my foreign editions with me, just in case. So off I went to kindergarten, and I sat down with the kids, and we're like 25 5-year-olds sort of gathered around me. And we talked about books and reading and imagination, creativity and characters and just all that sort of thing. And we really had a great conversation for 2.5 minutes, which is the average attention span of a kindergartner, and which I've since learned from my own experience it is 2 minutes and 15 seconds longer than the average attention span of a teenager. So then, Tommy was looking at Billy's belly button, and 2 kids were drawing on the wall, and a little girl was looking at the ceiling, talking to things there. Apparently I could not see. And I pulled out the movie poster, and we talked about how you turn books into movies and some of their favorite movies and characters, and how you can use your imagination to create pictures in your own head. And again, we had a great conversation, but again, only for about 2.5 minutes. So then, when the kids were getting sort of anxious, I pulled out my ace in the hole, my foreign edition books. And I looked at all the little kids and I said, "Okay, we're going to play a game. It's called Guess the Language. I'm going to hold up a book, and you're going to see the writing on the cover. You have to guess what language it is before we move on to the next book. And I figured this would last at least 25 minutes, which is the amount of time I had left with the 5-year-olds. I thought my plan was perfect. So I said, the kids were all very eager, they're watching and waiting, and I held up the first book, and the little boy said, "That's Spanish." I said, "Okay, that's an easy one." I put it down. I picked the next book up. The little girl in the back said, "That's Korean." Put that down. I picked up another book. A little boy in the back said, "It's Mandarin Chinese." I put that down. I picked up another book. A little girl in the back stood up and said, "That's Hebrew." I looked at it. That's what that one is. You know, they just send me the books. They don't tell me what the language is. So I went through 13 books in like 13 seconds until I only had one book left. And I said, okay, I bet no one can guess this language. And I held the book up. And even though it's been 11 years since this happened, I still remember so vividly the image of this 5-year-old girl standing up, little hands on little hips. She's got like 2 little ponytails sticking out of her head. She looks to be like the biggest idiot she's ever seen. And she said, "That's Latvian." Anybody here read or speak Latvian? Raise your hand. I'll send you a book. Well, later their teacher said, "You know, Mr. Baldacci, this school is in the suburb of Washington, D.C., and 27 foreign languages are spoken at this school." And I looked at her and I said, "Thanks for telling me. Would have been nice to know a little while ago." So I still had 24 minutes to go with these 5-year-olds, and I had no magic bullets left. So I thought to myself, you were a trial lawyer, you were paid to think on your feet, to problem solve, come up with something. They're only kids. So I happened upon a solution that I thought was a perfect one. And sort of confident, I looked at the little kids and I said, "Does anybody have any questions?" Hey, don't ever do that with 5-year-olds. Trust me, unless you don't care about having any self-respect left at all. A little girl stood up in the front row, pretty little girl. She's waving her hand frantically, and I said, "Oh, do you have a question?" And she didn't have a question. She proceeded to tell a highly personal and highly embarrassing story about her mother. I mean highly personal and highly embarrassing in a way that only a 5-year-old can manage to do. And all the other kids are like laughing and rolling all over the floor. I'm totally struck dumb. I can't speak. I'm just staring at this little girl. And finally I look over to the teacher for help, and of course the teacher's doing one of these. I can't believe he did that. So finally I look back at the little girl. I told my daughter to sit down. And like to never speak again while I was still living. Which clearly I would not be if Mom ever found out about that. Now, my daughter must have told my son this story about what Dad did for a living, because I took my son to a bookstore probably for the first time when he was maybe 3. I remember walking in with him, and now he's a teenager. I remember walking into him in the store, and he sees all the books and all these people reading, and all of a sudden my kid's eyes get like huge, and all of a sudden he starts running across the store, screaming at the top of his lungs, "My daddy will sign any book you've got for $2. You'd be glad to know I waived my signing fee tonight. Because of the good folks in Darien, Connecticut, I'm signing my books for free. Now, I started out as a short story writer, and when I was a kid, I loved to tell tall tales and yarns, typically to get myself out of trouble with parents, school officials, people like that. And my mom bought me a blank page book from a bookstore because I think she really wanted to shut me up, and she figured I would stop talking about these stories if I started writing them down instead. And I did, and I started writing all these little crazy stories down, and really I haven't looked back. And for probably 8 or 9 years, I was a short story writer. And I would submit my short stories when I was in high school and then in college to periodicals and magazines you probably have never even heard of. I'm not even sure they're in business anymore. One of them was The New Yorker. Atlantic Monthly, you know, rags. And I got lots of rejections back, as just was going to be the case. But what is a rejection? Well, as a writer, I've always treated rejection as a badge of honor. Because if you're a writer and you're ever rejected, it shows you're doing at least two things. One, you're writing and finishing a story, which those of you who have done it or attempted to do it, it's not that easy to do. Then you've taken this very precious thing, very personal thing that you've made with your heart and your soul and your sweat and your blood, and you send it off to a complete stranger, with the result being, if they even bother to read it, they're probably going to have something negative to say about it. I've always thought that badge of honor should be treated as a badge of honor. The only way you lose when you're rejected as a writer, or really anything in life, the only way you lose if you just allow a third person, a stranger, to dissuade you from following something you're passionate about. That's the only time you lose, when you get a rejection. And passion is a rare thing in life. And if you have it in anything, be very hesitant, loath to give it up, because you're never sure if it's going to come around again. That's the only time you ever lose, when you're rejected. Now, I moved from short stories to screenplay writing because a friend of mine went out to Los Angeles to break into film as a producer. He was there for about 3 years. He finally came back home, had not been successful, but he brought with him what was then, way back then, an unproduced screenplay that he had gotten hold of out there, and he asked me to read it and tell him what I thought of it. And I read it, and I told him I thought it was just garbage. There was no story. It was like a series of disjointed vignettes, and the humor was all potty humor, and there was no real character development at all. And I was convinced no one would ever make a movie out of this drivel. But Austin Powers went on to become a really big hit. Now, I'm sure none of you went to see it, but you know, millions of your fellow citizens did, and they really liked it a lot. Now, even though I obviously had no taste in screenplays because I had missed all the subtle nuance and sophistication of the Austin Powers franchise, nevertheless, I spent the next 4 years of my life, and I was practicing law in D.C. by this time, writing screenplays. And I thought it was fun. It was just another medium to write in. And instead of it ending up on the written page, what I was writing hopefully one day would end up on a wall while people were watching it, drinking, you know, supersized Cokes and big popcorns. And I got an agent in Los Angeles based on my screenplays, which is very difficult to do. Because I got to tell you, my first meeting I ever had with a producer in Los Angeles, he looked like he was about 12. But he was head of a pretty big production company. And we were just chit-chatting before the meeting was to start, to sort of break the ice. And he said, "So where are you coming in from?" He asked me, and I said, "Virginia." And he looked at me and he said, "What's that?" Not "where's that?" "What's that?" And I said, "It's a state." He said, "A state of what?" I said, "A state of the United States." And he said, "Okay, whatever." Now, I'm a native Virginian. I'm proud of where I come from. I'm sure you are too. And I said, "Well, actually, there are two Virginias." And he said, "No way." I said, "Yeah, there's a Virginia and there's a West Virginia." And he said, "Well, aren't people confused by that?" I said, "No, because West Virginia is actually in Canada." He was like, "Oh, I get that." So I thought, okay, maybe I'll be a lawyer during the day. I write screenplays at night, maybe get one option, maybe down the road get one actually made into a film. Well, I'd spent 3 years of my life during this part of my life writing my first novel, which was Absolute Power. For those of you who haven't seen the movie or watched the film, I'll give you a quick synopsis of the plot. Now, I think some of the best stories have simple plots. The main plot is fairly simple, and then the novelist goes in and complicates things using sort of literary devices and other machinations of story and plot. Here's the plot for Absolute Power. The President of the United States, not a really nice person. He has affairs with other women. During one of these trysts, something bad happens. There has to be a cover-up. Eventually, the truth comes out. At the end of the novel, he's impeached by the United States Congress. Now, when I wrote that story, it was entirely original. Oh, yeah. Oh yeah. If I had $1 for every fan letter and email I've gotten from people saying, I can't believe you turned a national scandal into a best-selling novel. What's wrong with you? And I tried to point out to them that the novel was written and published years before this other thing that happened for real. And they said, one lady wrote back and said, well, anybody can fudge dates. So that's the story of Absolute Power. And I really wrote that book because I'd worked in Washington, D.C. My office was near the White House. I would pass by, and I wrote Absolute Power when George Bush I was president. It's not based on him either. It's just based on a president who had some issues, but I was more concerned and interested in all the careers and lives that are tied to the presidency. So when the president does something wrong, what about everybody else? And in my book, you know, 2 Secret Service agents were sort of the moral linchpins in the story. They were great guys. They did their job. But in doing their job, they sort of became bad guys, and the novel explores what happens to them and other people. That's really the only reason I wrote the book. I thought it was an interesting story. Now, when you've written as many novels as I've written, and True Blue, the one that just came out, is my 18th adult novel that I've written. The years have gone by pretty fast. And you travel as much as I do, and I do travel quite a bit, both here and overseas. An interesting phenomenon occurs. I am rarely out in public when I don't see someone reading one of my novels. I came up this morning on the Acela train. There was a person in the train car reading one of my books. On a plane, I rarely ever go to the restroom on a plane when I don't pass somebody reading one of my novels, or coming up and asking me to sign one of the novels on the plane, or at a hotel or by the pool. Now, I have one rule about that. If I ever see you reading one of my books in public, I will never come up to you. For a couple of reasons. One, I'm actually a very private person, and I would never want to invade someone else's privacy. And secondly, and far more importantly, if you're not enjoying the book, I don't want to hear about it. I'm sensitive, what can I say? You know, that's what Amazon.com review boards are for, by the way. You can go onto Amazon.com and anonymously trash any writer you want. I went on there a few years ago and I read a review by a woman who gave me 1 star out of 5, which is the lowest that Amazon allows, and she was lamenting the fact in her review that Amazon did not allow for 0 stars, because that would have undoubtedly been my fate. And she said, my problem with this book is that I figured it out in the last 3 pages and therefore found it predictable. I guess the preceding 517 pages where she didn't figure it out just wasn't enough for her. But that one review has actually caused me to change the way that I write my novel, such that the actual resolutions for the books are no longer contained in the novel itself. Have you noticed this? If you look on the back of the dust jacket flap, there's a 1-800 number. You might have seen it. We accept all major credit cards. You get the actual resolution, so I won't be predictable, and you don't have to go on Amazon.com and give me 1 star. So that's my rule. In public, see you reading the book, not coming up. Now, about 5 years ago, I was in the middle of a book tour, and I flew into LAX really late at night. I had a busy day the next day. I got off the plane. I wanted to go grab my bag and go to the hotel and just collapse because I had a busy day the next day. Now, as I'm walking down the concourse towards baggage claim, I see a guy standing in the middle of one of the aisles with his luggage strewn around him, and he's standing there holding a book and reading a book all by himself. Now, it's almost midnight, and I looked at this guy, and my first reaction was, I mean, this poor guy has no life at all. I mean, he's totally by himself. It's midnight. He's reading a book just alone, and I felt kind of sad for him. But my next reaction was one of curiosity, because I'm a writer and I have lots of friends who are writers, and I was wondering what book would this guy possibly be reading. So as I walked past him, I kind of glanced back and I saw it was a copy of Absolute Power. Now I remember sort of vacillating back and forth. You know, should I? I've got this rule. Shouldn't I? I really got this rule. Finally I thought, he looks okay, and I kind of felt sorry for him anyway. So I walked over to the guy and I said, hey, looks like you were enjoying that book. And the guy didn't even lower the book. I couldn't even see his face. It was like, you know, this. And he said, yeah, it's great. It's a page turner. I'm really enjoying it. I said, well, actually, I'm really happy to hear that. Would you like me to sign it for you? So then the book came down a little bit, you know. The guy looks me up and down with beady little eyes, and he said, no. He said, why would I want you to write your name in my book? Like maybe he thought I was going to like run away with it or something. And I took a step back. I felt like a fool. And I said, sir, I'm so sorry about this. I have a rule actually about not doing what I just did. But I saw you reading the book. You said you were enjoying it. I just thought you'd like it autographed because I wrote it. And the guy gives me one of these again and he said, no, you didn't. I took another step back. I mean, I'm just trying to keep this so light and upbeat. And I said, you know, ironically enough, Absolute Power is my very first novel. I am David Baldacci. And the guy points a finger at me. I won't tell you which one. And he said, look, you freak. You're not Baldacci, and get away from me before I call the police. Now, by this time, a small crowd had gathered around us, I guess, waiting for us to, hit each other. I could only assume this happens a lot at LAX, Guy walking around, white hair, a beard. I'm Mark Twain. I'm dead. But I saw you reading Huckleberry over there. Well, I'm a nice guy. I'm a calm guy. It takes a lot to get me upset, but man, this man had pushed my buttons way past maximum. So I said, excuse me. I reached up, pulled the book out of his hand. I flipped it around where there was a big picture of me on the back. I looked at it and I said, do you see Buckaroo? I am Baldacci. So he looks at the picture, he looks at me, he gets a really silly expression on his face. He slowly reaches into his pocket. He pulls out a pen, he's looking down at his loafers, he's chuckling. And he said, Mr. Baldacci, what an honor. Would you sign my book for me, sir, please? What could I do? I laughed, too. I slapped him on the back, as hard as I possibly could. And I said, no. And I did. I signed his book. What can you do? Now, last year, my family and I usually go overseas during the summer, and the kids get to sort of see different cultures in different countries, and we've always had a lot of fun. Last year we went to Italy, Rome and Florence. We also went to Tuscany. Now I'm Italian-American. You could probably tell by all the vowels in my last name. And I wanted to go to the village Barga, which is about 60 kilometers north of Pisa, where my grandfather was born and grew up before he immigrated to the United States. Now I never knew my grandfather, Amadeo. He passed away before I was born. But I wanted to go to that town, and had for a long time. I'd been to Italy before, but never had an opportunity to go to this sort of remote mountain walled city. It's set up like a miniature Lucca, if you know Lucca. So decided we're going to go. We went to Italy with another family, so there was like 10 of us, including like 4 teenagers. And before we went, I got an email from the mayor of Barga. And he said, I read in an Italian magazine that you were vacationing in Italy, and I'd love for you to come to Barga, and I would like to take you to lunch in Barga. And I wrote back and said we were planning to come anyway. That would be terrific. We'll come and have a nice sort of private lunch with you, and I could see the town. Terrific. So we made the date. We went to Italy. The day came for us to go. We piled into 2 cars. It was like 2.5 hours through sort of windy mountain, back Italian roads, and it takes a while to get anywhere in Italy, particularly in Tuscany. And we've been driving for a long time. It was getting very close to the time we were supposed to be there, and finally we had gotten lost twice. And finally I stopped the car sort of in the middle of the road, and I looked at my wife who was navigating, and I said, do you think this is the place? And she looked out the window and she said, well, considering there's a 12-foot tall poster of you on that wall over there, pretty safe bet this is the right place. And I said, what are the police doing here? And the police were directing traffic. So I pulled up to one and I rolled down the window. I said, officer, can you tell me what's going on here? And he said, it's David Baldacci Day in Barga. Park over there. Now, I'm dressed in a polo shirt, shorts, and flip-flops. My wife is similarly casually dressed. My kids are like in cutoffs. My wife is looking at me like, I can't believe you did this to me. And I'm like, I had no idea. It was a lunch, not Baldacci Day. I don't know what's going on. My teenage daughter is looking at me like, I will never forgive you for this ever. So we parked and we got out. I said, I'm sure it's still going to be low-key. Forget the poster and the cards. It's going to be low-key. Don't worry. And then the gates to the city open, and the mayor marches out with the Italian flag and the American flag draped over. There's a marching band behind him. I kid you not. You can see it all on the internet. It's already been posted there by Barga. And behind the mayor are like the 9,000 people who live in Barga. So the mayor comes up to us and gives us all the double kiss, and in some cases triple kisses, and they flew the American flag over the city for the first time since World War II. My picture was on every door and window in Barga. I'm sure people were sick of seeing this guy on their stuff. And we took a tour of the city. We went and had a nice intimate lunch with myself, the family, the mayor, 1,100 of my close personal friends. And we went to the Duomo at the top, and I saw the avenues and streets where my grandfather was raised. And then the mayor said, okay, now it is time to go to the central courtyard of the city where you will deliver your grand speech. I'm not sure how grand it will be, but I will deliver it as best I can. So we went to the center courtyard where the entire crowd gathered, including 60 Baldaccis I had never met before, but who lived in Barga. And the band played, another song, and then they stopped, and the mayor got up, and they had translators there, and he gave this big speech, and they started giving me stuff. I have a lifetime supply of olive oil, the St. Christopher's Medal, which is their patron saint. They made me an honorary citizen of Barga. Now, the mayor did pull me aside and say, this is contingent upon you only voting for me. I had no problem with that. They gave me a genealogical chart showing the Baldaccis coming to Barga in the 1300s, all the way up to my grandfather's generation, where I saw my grandfather's name and his 11 siblings, 7 of whom I had never even heard their names, so that was very interesting to see. And then they also gave me a journal from the town archives that was first started writing in by my ancestor Peter Baldacci in 1630. And it had been handed down from generation to generation because the paper was so scarce back then, and the last entry is 1887. A beautiful Italian script. I had my friends at the Library of Congress conserve it for me, so it's in a very protected space that will last for generations to come. So it was just a marvelous day. It started out kind of iffy, but it was just a marvelous day. And if you go onto the Barga website, you'll see lots of stuff. You'll see a very surprised American author. But it really was a terrific day, and the best part was to see the place, the town where my grandfather grew up. It was a nice connection for me, even though I really never knew him. Now, I do a lot of research for my novels. If you've read them, hopefully you can tell that I really do get out in the field and try to get things as right as I can. And sometimes when you do a lot of research, things get a little bit dicey. I went down to the Secret Service a number of years ago to write a book about the Secret Service, or former Secret Service agents Sean King and Michelle Maxwell, and my split second was the novel. And they were very accommodating, very generous with the time. I went through lots of different places and facilities with them. They answered all my questions. I made everybody from the director of the Secret Service all the way down to people who work on the streets. And as we were going to another part of the building at the elevator, we were waiting for an elevator to come, and another agent who was not with our party walked by, and he had his gun and his badge on his belt. And he saw me, and all of a sudden he did a double take, and he turned around and he pointed at me, and he yelled across the hall, and he said, "Hey, you!" I don't like guys with guns yelling at me. It's just a little unnerving. And I said, is there a problem? He said, I don't know. Are you David Baldacci? And I said, I don't know. Do you like his books? He said, yeah, I love him. I'm a big fan. I said, I'm him. He said, well, that's a relief. And I said, why is that a relief? And he said, look, I walked by and I saw you. I knew you, but I had no idea why I knew you. And finally it hit me. You're either a guy that I've read or a guy I've arrested. No, I'm the guy you read. Now, this next story illustrates the point quite finely, I think, that no matter how well-known you think you are never as well-known as you think you are. I was at a restaurant with my wife having a nice lunch in some city. I don't even remember where the city was. I probably blanked it out of my memory. And we're eating, and every once in a while I'd look up, and across the restaurant there was this woman having lunch with her husband, I assumed, and every time I looked up she was staring right at me. And this happened like 5 or 6 times until finally I looked at my wife and I said, I think that woman's going to come over here. And sure enough, a couple minutes later, here she comes, marching over. She sits down next to me. She looks at me and said, "You are who I think you are, aren't you?" Which is kind of an odd question if you think about it. And I said, "Well, do you read fiction?" And she said, "Oh, yes, I do." I said, "Well, I probably am who you think I am then." She said, "I knew it." So she turns and screams across the restaurant to her husband, "I was right, Joe. It's Grisham." Now, I know John. John and I are good friends. We've done events in the past. We're going to do an event up here in Connecticut next year, in fact. I like John a lot. At that point in my life, didn't like John at all. I'm sure you can understand why. Now, my poor wife, like blew iced tea out of her nose. But very politely to the woman said, "Right genre, wrong author." And the woman looked mortified, and then she looked at me again and she said, "Oh my gosh, are you Baldacci?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." She turns and screams across the restaurant to her husband, "You were right, Joe, it's the Italian." I need a better publicist, obviously. I was researching another novel where I really got into some trouble because of the way I conducted the research. This was years ago, I was on the Amtrak Casella train in D.C., and I was sitting at a table where you share space with other people. So I'm sitting on one side, and these two businessmen are sitting on the other side. Now, I assume they were businessmen. They had suits on and laptops, cell phones, Blackberries, these really cool miniature satellite towers. You ever seen those? Just right sits on the table, like broadcasts everywhere. I was on my cell phone, and I was calling a friend of mine who's a medical examiner in the Bronx Medical Examiner's Office, because she was a recognized expert on this subject matter that I needed to know about in order to write this story, knowledgeably. All I wanted to do on the phone was make an appointment to meet with her face-to-face at her office when I got into New York, because I like to do my interviews sort of face-to-face. Now, unfortunately, she told me that she was leaving to go overseas, which she does from time to time, on special assignment. And she was going to be gone for at least 3 weeks. And she was leaving in a matter of hours before I even got to New York. She said, "You can either ask me now, or you'll have to wait until I get back into the country, because I won't be able to communicate once I'm out of the country." And I said, "Well, you know what? My research schedule is kind of tight on this. I don't think I can wait for 3 weeks. Why don't let's just do it now?" So I had my questions, and I said, "Okay, Doc, here's basically how I want to kill the guy." Hindsight is 20/20, of course. And I went through my very elaborate poisoning technique that I'd given a lot of thought to, let me tell you. I said, "Doc, now I've got to make sure that when the police investigate this crime, they will have no idea I've murdered him." They won't? Great. And I said, "As you also know, there's going to be a post-mortem done on the body, an autopsy. I need to make sure that I'll be able to fool the medical examiner too. They won't know that this person has died by violent means by me." And she said, "Absolutely not. It's a perfect crime." In fact, my friend, the medical examiner, went on to say, "David, I've often thought about murdering people. And if I were going to do it, I'd do it just the way you described, because really it is the perfect crime." So I asked her a few more questions, and I finally ended the phone call by saying, "I got to tell you, Doc, if I ever need to kill anybody else, I'm going to call you." So I put the phone down, and I finished writing my notes up, and I looked up. Now, this guy over here had spilled his coffee from his neck to his belt. He was like this huge brown stain. And the dude right across from me was not saying anything. He was just looking at me like this. Over his shoulder, here come the Amtrak police. I didn't make it to New York that day. I was what was called detained as a person of interest. Now, if you read the acknowledgments in Split Second, which is a section of the book, usually at the end, where the writer thanks people for helping them with the book, the last acknowledgment in Split Second reads pretty much just like this. "To any and all passengers on the Amtrak Casella train, who might have overheard me discussing with various experts poisoning techniques for purposes of researching and writing the novel, and were probably scared out of their wits at my diabolical intent. I apologize. And I thought it was very fair of the judge to let me do it that way. Do you see what writers do for readers? Do you see now the sacrifices we make to get it just right? I was at the LA Times Book Festival 2 years ago. And somebody in the crowd, we did a Q&A afterwards as well, and somebody in the audience asked me a question I had never been asked before in the 14 or 15 years that I've been doing these sorts of things. The guy stood up and said, "What is the most bizarre thing that's ever happened to you out in public connected with your career as a writer?" And even though no one had ever asked me that question before, the answer, the most bizarre thing that ever happened, came readily to mind. And I told them, and I will tell you. I just did the National Book Festival again this year in Washington. 135,000 people came down to the National Mall and celebrated with about 80 writers and storytellers. It was absolutely terrific. I've done it about six times in the past, and it's always a great event. John Grisham was there, and a whole host of others. Michael Connelly, just a great lineup. Now, I also did it 2 or 3 years ago, and the event, the pre-festival event, is a black tie dinner at the Library of Congress's Thomas Jefferson Building, which is a beautiful, amazingly beautiful architectural masterpiece. If you haven't been there, I would recommend you go there, the Thomas Jefferson Building. It's like 150 tables, crystal and just linen. Just really, they go all out for this. And they have a writer to sit at every table, because this is the dinner where the library and the country thank, all the patrons and sponsors of the National Book Festival. And there are a lot of them. Everybody from Target department stores to AT&T, just really big patrons. So I went and got my table assignment. I was seated at table 3, and I was there by myself because it's just authors come, not their spouses. So I go through a sea of tables to find my table, and I find it, and there's nobody there yet, so I'm sort of curious. I'm walking around the table looking at the name cards they have to see who's going to be at my table. And it was, chairman of AT&T, president of Target stores, a big Texas commercial real estate developer, me, a lady who was just identified as being from Maine, President George W. Bush, and it went around the table. Okay. So because the president was going to be at this table, the Secret Service sent over sort of an advance team to make sure that, we authors weren't packing anything we shouldn't have been packing. And as it turned out, the lead agent on his protection detail that night was a woman who was a friend of mine because she'd helped me on research on a book several years before. And I didn't know what the protocol was, but so I went over to her and I gave her a hug. She gave me the most amazing frisking. It really was quite memorable. Anyway. So then the president walks up, surrounded by his diamond pack of Secret Service agents, and I guess he looked at me like, what the hell are you hugging my Secret Service agent for? And I had met President Bush when he was the governor of Texas, and I had gone out to Texas to do an event for his mother, Barbara Bush, family literacy. And I've done a number of events. It's a great cause. I raised millions of dollars for literacy and then spread it all over the country. So we all sat down. And there was a woman to my left. She was the real estate developer from Texas. And the woman to my right was a very elegant woman, probably in her early 80s, beautifully dressed, amazingly everything. She was very well put together, very amazingly polite, very nice. She obviously knew the president. She was conversing with him. I was talking to the president a little bit, and he, I sent his best to his parents and all that. So then the older woman turned to me, and she said, very politely again, she said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Oh, well, I'm one of the writers of the National Book Festival." And she said, "What's your name?" And I told her, and she said, "I've never heard of you." I said, "That's okay, lots of people haven't, no problem." And he said, "What sort of books do you write?" And I said, "Well, I write mysteries and thrillers." She said, "I read a mystery one time." She said, "Have you ever heard of Raymond Chandler?" I said, "Absolutely, he was legendary, back in the 40s and 50s, terrific writer, yes." And she said, "Well, I really liked his book." And I said, "Me too." And then just turned to other conversation, and I'm talking to the woman on my left. And a few minutes later, something grabs my arm. And I turn and I see the older woman staring at me, and she looks unusual. And I said, "Are you okay? What's wrong?" She goes, "I've got it. I've got it." And I said, what do you have and can I catch it? She said, I just thought of a way to off the president. Yeah, that was pretty much my reaction. I said, excuse me? She said, I just thought of a way to off the president. You're a mystery writer. I thought you'd like to hear it. I said, no. Don't really want to hear it. I said, you realize also that he's sitting next to you? She goes, yes, that's what made me think of it. It's brilliant. I said, ma'am, I'm going to go back and finish my carrots. I suggested you go ahead and finish your meal. She goes, no, I really want to tell you. I said, we can't talk about this, okay? This is a federal crime to talk about this. This is like talking about a bomb on an airplane. You can't do that. She goes, well, it also involves the Secret Service. I said, yes, like the 6 agents ringing this table, who would not want to hear this conversation either. Trust me. She said, well, I'm going to tell you, young man, and you're going to listen. I'm like, what's with these people from Maine? I just don't get this. I said, okay, can you whisper it? She goes, okay, here's my idea. The president is guarded by Secret Service agents. I was like, yeah. So my villain will go to a Secret Service agent's home, off him, take his place, go to the White House, off the president. Brilliant. I said, that won't work. She said, why not? I said, well, they would know he's not a Secret Service agent. And she said, oh, the president can't possibly know all the agents who guard him. And I said, well, his personal protection detail, he would know all of them because he's with them 24/7. And I said, forget that. The Secret Service is like this elite agency. They actually have things called supervisors. So not only would they know that he's not a Secret Service agent and would not let him into the White House when he showed up, they would arrest him on the spot. Your idea would not work at all. Sorry. She said, well, I think it will work. I said, well, you write the book then. She said, well, I'm going to see what he thinks. As a disclaimer, I'm not making any of this up. Not even my imagination is that weird. I said, well, who thinks? She said, President Bush, of course. I said, ma'am, you're going to ask the President of the United States his opinion of your scheme to off him? I said, you don't know me, I don't know you. I'm actually a lawyer. I would counsel you strongly not to do that. She goes, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And I said, fine. I actually lifted my chair up and turned my chair this way, put it down. I'm talking to this lady here. So, but I hear her, and she tells the president the whole idea. And let me tell you, the whole table goes stone cold silent. You know, it's like the AT&T chairman like hocked a Brussels sprout right out of his mouth. Now, I didn't want to look, you know, but it's like a train wreck. You gotta look. So I'm talking to this lady here who's staring at me and staring at her. I do one of these. And President Bush is not looking at the lady. He's looking right at me. And he said, ma'am, you ever read any of David Baldacci's books? She said, no, I've read Raymond Chandler. He said, well, you ought to try him. Because that boy has got a very vivid imagination. Like I put her up to it. I haven't been invited back to anything. So that was undoubtedly the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. Now, outside, there's a big white box. We have a family foundation called the Wish You Well Foundation. And it is devoted to eradicating illiteracy across the United States. The building you're in is dedicated to that as well, being a library. Literacy is such a fundamental thing that the lack thereof is tied to every social ill that we have, from poverty to prejudice to crime. Tied to every single one. If we can eradicate illiteracy, most of those other problems and issues go away. But we have a huge illiteracy problem in the United States. There are 304 million Americans. There are 200 million adults in this country. 100 million of us, 100 million adults, read at the two lowest levels of literacy. meaning they cannot read a book, they can't read a newspaper, they can't even read a grocery list, much less a health care reform bill. And that really does jeopardize their being full and operating citizens in a democracy. Democracy is based on a literate, opinionated, fully well-informed citizenry. We do not have that in this country anymore. That's why literacy is so fundamental. Now, we have funded programs in over 40 states and counting, including programs up here in Connecticut. And we will continue to do so. We also have a program called Feeding Body and Mind. And what that does, when I'm out on book tour, I bring these big white boxes, they're shipped ahead. People bring in new and gently used books. Once the box is full, we send FedEx or UPS here with a shipping label, and they'll take it to the local area food bank. So your donations will stay in the local Connecticut area. Our goal is to not only eradicate hunger in the United States, both at a physical level but also at a mental level. Most people seeking food assistance are going there because they are not self-sustaining. They can't support themselves because they have low job skills. And almost 99% of those people, they have low job skills because they have low reading and literacy skills. It's just a no-brainer. That's just the way it is in this country and in most other countries. So we feel if we get books front and center with this population, we can make a difference. I have never known a bad thing from a book being in a home. I have known many bad things happen because of a lack of books being in a home. We've collected to date hundreds of thousands of books just on my book tours alone. Now I have about a dozen best-selling authors who have joined with me. Two who are out right now as I am this fall on book tour collecting books are Michael Connolly, my good friend, and Sue Grafton, my good friend. So if you ever go to any of their book signings, please bring in books for the boxes because they will be there. Our goal is to collect millions of books every year, take them out of the hands of people who have too many books probably, and put them in the hands of people who have too few. I can cite statistic after statistic to you. They're all appalling about the lack of literacy and the lack of book ownership in the United States. You know, when you have entire states where they can tell you that 60% of our population in this state have never owned a book in their home, or 70% of this population sector of a particular state have never read a book, then it really does start to make you think what's in store, what the future of this country is. Because once we lose that, we lose a lot. And you see sort of some of the rending of social fabric now, because literacy leads to also something else. It's called ignorance. And ignorance invariably leads to the other evil super twin of history that ignorance always has with it, and it's called intolerance. You will never find one without the other because they're like cancers who feed off of one another. It's a tumor in a blood supply that never ends. Ignorance and intolerance. Now, once a population becomes ignorant, they oftentimes don't argue with the reason, with their minds, with words. They yell, and they use force and violence to get their point across. It's happened in other countries. And to assume that it can never happen here, I think guarantees that you've almost ensured that it will happen here at some point. We have to be very diligent and vigilant to make sure that it never happens here. If you think about it, and since I'm standing in a library, dictators have like little cheat sheets they use when they take over a country. I didn't know they did, but Newsweek magazine published one about a year ago. And there are like 10 things that most dictators do when they take over a country to repress it. The very first thing that all these dictators do, the very first thing when they come in, they close and shutter all the libraries. Because that's where the forum for open ideas and diversity and opinion and knowledge and wisdom come from. So once they close those, they can repress any society. So you're standing in a building tonight that really stands as a testament for the open society we have in America. So anything you can do to help Wish You Well Foundation or Feeding Body and Mind, I would encourage you to do so. Now, I'll close with this story, and then we'll do the Q&A. It illustrates the point that a book can change your life. Maybe it's happened to you. It certainly happened to me. Now, most of my career, as a lawyer, I was at a small firm. And I liked that a lot. It was very collegial. You knew everybody. You knew all the clients of the firm. And you really felt like you were building something together. My last year in practice, my little firm was absorbed by this huge multinational law firm. And instead of attorney David Baldacci, I became pretty much attorney 587. Not nearly as personal, by the way. I was assigned to work with a senior partner at this firm who had been described to me as the most anal lawyer in America. Now, it might surprise some of you to learn that lawyers could be a little anal about stuff, a little detail-oriented, and I include myself in that category. But this, apparently they have a competition every year, and this guy kept winning the anal competition. So I was assigned to work with him. And I remember that he never used a pen or a computer. He would only work in pencil. And he had a jar of pencils on his desk, and if the points were sharp, they would be pointing up to the ceiling. If they got a little bit dull, he would flip them over so the eraser was showing. And then that was a cue for his long-suffering secretary, of which he had many, to rush in and sharpen his pencils. So we were working on this transaction where our client was buying another company. And the senior partner asked me to call the lawyer on the other side of the deal, and it was an amicable deal, and confirm that 3 facts were true or not. And he gave me the facts. So I called the lawyer up. I asked him the questions. I wrote everything up in a little memo, which is how you communicate at big firms. I sent the memo off to the senior partner. He read the memo and he called me up and he said, "Did you write this memo?" And he sort of read it partially to me. And I said, "Yeah, I wrote that." He said, "Come to my office immediately." So I went down to his corner office, sat down, and he said, "Read this memo to me." And I said, "Well, okay." I called attorney so-and-so on the phone. I received a verbal representation that the following 3 facts were true. And I listed the facts and parentheticals, the status of each, and that was pretty much my memo. He said, "Okay, you called him on the phone?" I said, "Yeah, that's what you told me to do." He said, "All right. And you received a verbal representation?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay. Tell me, do you know the difference between oral and verbal?" I just looked at him for like a really long time. And finally I said, "You know what? Not in my whole life have I ever had to think about that." But I think about it now, and I guess oral technically sort of means spoken language, whereas verbal could include spoken language and also the sounds that living things make, like the grunt of a monkey. And he said, "Exactly. You didn't receive a verbal representation. You received an oral representation. I don't tolerate imprecision in my lawyers. Don't ever let that happen again." Now, the whole time the guy's talking to me, the theme song from like the Twilight Zone is flashing through my head for some reason. And I looked at him, and he's a senior partner, and I was not. And I said, "I really apologize. I went to a really great law school at the University of Virginia. It's quite obvious now that I missed oral verbal day." "But now that I know it's important to you, it'll never happen to this lawyer again. You whack job." Now, I didn't oralize or verbalize the whack job part. I was just sort of thinking it, and I didn't. Now, we all have unpleasant situations, encounters we have with fellow employees or bosses, and they're not fun. We all have to go through them. That was just my day to have to go through it. No big deal. So I went back to my office and went back to work, and I thought it was over, but it wasn't over, because in the inter-office mail that same day, this lawyer sent me 2 items. One was a page from a book. I have no idea where he found this book, but he had taken the page and had it copied and blown up to poster board size. And on the top of it, the header said, "How to tell the difference between oral and verbal." And it had 6 helpful bullet points so that morons like myself would never make that mistake again. And the second item he sent me was a book, and the title of that book was How to Write Well. Now, maybe I'm too sensitive, but I thought it was a little bit of overkill for the oral verbal, snafu thingy. And I was also embarrassed because all the other lawyers knew he had sent me this, and they probably thought I was just incompetent, boom. And it was unpleasant. Well, the very next day, my first novel, Absolute Power, which I had spent 3 years of my life working on, sold for the most money ever spent on a first novel in the history of American publishing. It was a pretty good day for me. After many, many years of not making a dime. And the other thing you have to realize is all those years I was writing, by the time Absolute Power sold, I had been writing consistently for about 18 years. I never really sold anything up to that point. I had been writing in pretty much complete privacy. The only people who knew I was writing all those years were my wife, my mom and my dad, and my brother and my sister. Not even my in-laws knew I was writing all those years. None of my close friends. No one I'd ever practiced law with knew I was writing, because it was just my personal thing. I had nothing to tell them. I was just kind of writing in my spare time. So that day, obviously my wife and I had to go around and tell people, my in-laws and close friends, and they were stunned and shocked and all that, but that's just the way it was. And I told a little white lie to my firm because I had to go to New York the next day, and Time Warner had bought the publishing rights to Absolute Power, so they were throwing me like a party, and it was very cool. I mean, film rights were sold, and foreign rights were sold, and all these markets, and people were like throwing checks at me as fast as they could, and I didn't know who they were, but it was cool nonetheless. My idea was to go back to Washington and sort of slowly explain to a firm that I hadn't even been there a year, that I'd been writing all these years, I got an incredible break, and that's it. Well, my plans went awry because while I was in New York, my agent handed me a photocopy of a newspaper article, and it told the whole story about me and the big deal, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked him, I said, what newspaper is that in? And he said, it's in today's Wall Street Journal. Well, back then, I think every law firm in the world, certainly the big ones, subscribed to the Wall Street Journal. So I immediately called my secretary back in D.C. and I said, by any chance, has anyone stumbled upon this obscure article about me? And she said, oh my gosh, David, the whole firm is shut down. All like 12 offices across the country. They're all out in the hallway. They're all reading the story and they're all asking me, who in the hell is Attorney 587? It must have been some book he wrote. So I got back to D.C. the next day, and I was slowly explaining people, my backstory, how this had happened. And everybody was very happy, congratulating me, very laudatory. That was nice. And I went back to my desk, because I still worked there and would for almost a year afterwards, and I saw that stupid book on my desk, How to Write Well. This is not apocryphal. This all happened to me, actually. So I sat and stared at that book for like 30 minutes, and finally I said, you're never going to have another chance like this in your whole life. So I picked up the book, and I went down to the big senior partner's office and walked in. He's sitting behind his desk. He's not looking too happy. He's read the story. He knows I'm not going to be sharpening his pencils much longer. But with as much sincerity as I could muster, I held out that book he had sent me, and I said, I just wanted you to know how much this book has changed my life.
Now we come to the Q&A part. David, what inspired you to write about sisters in True Blue? And will this be a series?
True Blue is the latest novel. I did a lot of fascinating research for this. The story revolves around two sisters. One is a DC police chief. And the reason I wrote her as a character, I was just named as a contributing editor to Parade magazine. So I write for them now. I'm doing another story for them that'll be out in December. I had written a story on Kathy Lanier. At age 15, she was a high school dropout, an unwed mother. She divorced at age 18, and she was spiraling downward very fast. Turned her life around. She has 2 master's degrees from Johns Hopkins now, and she went from beat cop to DC police chief in 19 years. Just an amazing role model for a lot of people. So I wrote that story, and that got me very interested in a side of Washington I'd never really written about in my political thrillers. It's the side that you don't see if you just go to see the monuments. D.C. is also a big city with the same problems, violence, gang violence, murders, all that major cities have. And True Blue sort of combines that world that I've never really written a whole lot about in my books with the political world that I have. I had written about brothers in books before, and 2 or 3 other books that I've written. I'd never really explored sisters. Now, most of my novels, if you've read them, they have strong, independent women in the novels. I don't write about damsels in distress. I don't know any. I know a lot of my guy friends who need a lot of help, but not many women who need a lot of help. So that's what I write about. And in this one, it just seemed the perfect thing, because Beth Perry is the police chief. She's sort of the golden child. She's very caring, incredibly professional. She's never failed at anything. Her sister Mace Perry, her younger sister, is sort of the exact opposite. She was an undercover cop, bent the rules, to make sure that she got the bad guy. She was framed for some crime she didn't commit. She was sent to prison for 2 years. She's back in D.C. She can't be a cop anymore because she has a felony conviction. And she wants to be a blue again. She wants to be a true blue again. And she's trying to figure out a way to do that. And even though it's a really cool thriller, it's got a lot of interesting twists and turns, the relationship between the two sisters really drives the book. They are sometimes rivals. but they care a lot about each other, but they do things very differently. They each want the same goal, which is to, catch the bandit and see the person punished, but they get there different ways. And I think that probably can apply to lots of siblings. I have siblings of my own, and I'm the father of siblings, both boys and girls. So I've seen that dynamic happen in my own family. And whereas with brothers, you write it a slightly different way. With sisters, and I've had a lot of experience with that as well, you write it a slightly different way. I don't like to generalize gender at all, but I do sort of pick out observations I've made along the way about how men and women sometimes react to things differently or handle situations differently in certain situations. And that's what really fascinated me with this story. I went on walk-alongs and ride-alongs with police officers in some really high-crime areas in D.C. My wife wasn't too happy about that, but I figured I needed to get out there and see it for myself to do justice to the novel. And the ride-alongs were cool, and then when the walk-alongs were like, okay, it's time to get out of the cruiser, let's go catch some bad guys. I go, okay. So we're sneaking through alleys, looking for drug dealers and other people, and I was like, just keep in mind, you have Kevlar body armor, I have a big pen. That's all I'm saying. I'll just keep that in mind. And the scariest thing that happened, we were going down one alley, and I was with just one other police officer, and we were passing this 6-foot-high wooden fence, opaque fence, you couldn't see through it. And all of a sudden, something slammed against the fence so hard that it knocked 2 boards off, and one of the boards hit me in the head. So we're to jump back, and the police officer pulls his Glock, and he's like pointing it, and it's this enormous dog in this yard. And he's like a Rottweiler, Pit Bull, Mastiff. I love dogs. I've got 2 big dogs of my own. I love dogs, but man, I wasn't loving this dog because this dog was actually had its teeth around the last board trying to torque it off so he could come through the gap. And I looked at the officer and I said, so what do we do in this situation? He said, run. So we're hauling butt down the alleyway, and as we're running, I'm asking him, so whose dog is that? And he said, that's Psycho's dog. And I said, who's Psycho? He said, Psycho's a double murderer. He's in prison. He left his damn dogs. They're even meaner than Psycho is. There's like another one of those dogs in there. I just saw one. I was so impressed by that one of the characters in True Blue is Psycho. And as you read the character, you will find that he is indeed Psycho. It was a fun book to write. I even went on the harbor patrols with some of the police officers that patrolled the Anacostia and the Potomac. It was really cool because while we were out in the water, I'm a boater. I've been a boater, skippered boats for a long time, and I love being out in the water. I got to tell you though, when you're in a police boat and you're doing 60 knots and like 3-foot chop, you really are grateful for the hydraulic seats they have that really keep you from being paralyzed. But while we were out on the Potomac, we get a call from the Secret Service that the president was coming in from Andrews Air Force Base in the chopper caravan, Marine One. And whenever that happens, the Harbor Patrol has to go and pick up a Secret Service agent at the water headquarters. And the Secret Service agent on the boat follows the convoy on the river. As he's looking above, he's looking all around for threats and stuff that might go against the Marine One convoy. So that was very cool. And I enjoyed that research a lot. I hope you enjoy the book. Mace Perry and Beth Perry will be back. I think it's the start of another franchise. I really like the dynamic they have. And so I think you'll see the True Blues again.
That's good news. A typical writing day for you, what's that like?
I have no typical writing day at all. My days are typical for being atypical. I have an office outside the house. I have 3 full-time employees who work there with me, handling lots of different things that allow me to focus just on the writing. I go to the office pretty much every day. It's only about 10 minutes from my house. Some days I write all day. Other days I'm either out in the field researching or doing interviews or being interviewed by people in my office, or else I'm on book tour, or my kids are both teenagers, almost college age, and I do a lot of stuff with them because they're not going to be around with me much longer, and you got to take advantage of that. I've always done my daughter's the oldest. I've done her life in like 6s, for 1 to 6, 6 to 12, then you realize 12 to 18. I got, oh my God. I got one trident left of her life before she goes off to college, and now I've only got 1.5 years left with her. So I do a lot of stuff with my kids as well. I write in big bursts, such that I could sit down in one day and maybe crank out 10,000 words. I don't count words. That doesn't seem like a reasonable target for me to say, I just got to hit 2,000 words and I'm out of here. I'd go play golf. That's what I really wanted to do. It's not the quantity of numbers, it's actually words, it's what the words actually say and are, and that's what I focus on. And then a week go by and I don't write anything at all, because I haven't thought it through, it hasn't crystallized in my mind. And I don't want to sit down at a blank screen and try to make it come, because if it doesn't come, I know I haven't prepared myself well enough. So a big part of my job is to daydream, use my imagination. There's nothing wrong with being creative when you're writing creatively. I don't necessarily write from big outlines. I don't know how the book is going to end when I first write it. I may not know how the book is going to end on page 300, and I'm still writing it. Spontaneity is also not such a bad thing when you're being creative. If I outline anything, it might be a few pages or a couple of chapters ahead. I love sitting down thinking I'm going to write a certain part of the story that day, and all of a sudden I just take a left-hand turn and write something completely different. That's always served me well. I've always trusted my instinct on that. So for me, writing fiction from a strict outline just does not work. I've always felt that if I wrote from a strict outline, it would read to all of you like I wrote from a strict outline where everything sort of progresses from A to B to C. I like A, B, Z. Z is what gets all of you. You're like, wow, that was a Z. Should have been an F, but it was a Z. That's really cool. I'm going to hang with this guy a little longer.
This is probably the most asked question that we've heard. Are you bringing back the Camel Club?
Yes, the Camel Club will be back. There's really something about these camels, the idea for those of you who don't know the Camel Club, they are 4 guys. It started out as 4 guys. And they're headed by a man who calls himself Oliver Stone. Not the film director, the other Oliver Stone. And he has a very unique background. And they've been through 4 adventures thus far with me. They've been through the initial Camel Club, The Collectors, Stone Cold, and the last one was Divine Justice. The idea for John Carr / Oliver Stone came to me when I first moved to Washington, D.C. to practice law back in the mid-1980s. And I would walk past the White House, and back then you could drive past the White House too. Lafayette Park was very different looking back then. It was filled with what I called permanent White House protesters who were there protesting against environmental, disasters, nuclear arms race, and all that. In fact, the first banner I ever saw in Lafayette Park said, "Have a nice doomsday." I saw that banner, I was like, maybe I should move back to Richmond. But when I saw these permanent White House protesters, as I called them, and they had these little kind of tents and little pockets in the park where they had all the brochures and flyers and everything, I thought about, what if there's a guy there who has this really mysterious backstory because of something he's done in his past, and he's there at that park protesting, but he has sort of a different agenda, and what if he has sort of a group of friends? And that idea just stuck in my head for like 16 or 17 years, and I never really did anything with it until I sat down to write the first Camel Club novel, and it all sort of came pouring out. His whole backstory and his life sort of came pouring out on the page as though I'd been working on it all those years. So people really do love the Camel Club. They're the most unusual band of heroes. They're about, on paper, they're about as unheroic a set of heroes as it is possible to be. But it also lets people have some hope that, even sort of ordinary people, seemingly ordinary people, if they work together, they can accomplish great things from time to time. And that's such a comforting thought when you think about it, that ordinary people, seemingly ordinary, if the right motivation and they band together with like-minded people, can accomplish extraordinary things.
And finally, what are you working on now, and when can we get our hands on it?
I wrote a novel a couple of years ago called The Whole Truth. It was my first sort of international thriller where most of the action took place in other countries. And the protagonist in that novel was a guy named Shaw. He only has one name. And if you meet Shaw on the pages, you realize he pretty much only needs one name to get by. It was funny because when I wrote that novel, it deals with the idea of perception management, The Whole Truth, where you can hire a firm to perception manage a message for you to get the world to believe a lie. No matter how big the lie is, they can do things that make people believe it using the media and the internet and blogs, orchestrating events on the ground. So you really do believe something is actually true even though it's totally false. I remember the day the book was published, this novel on perception management. The New York Times ran the longest investigative article I've ever seen. It ran like 11 pages in the New York Times on the perception management program they had at the Pentagon, where they would use perception management to orchestrate sort of their telling of things. And it's not just government that does it. You know, big firms hire perception managers. The best ones are actually in the Washington, D.C. area. I wonder why that is. Anyway. And you hire them, countries hire them for a lot of money. If they're engaged in a war and they want to look better, they hire a perception manager firm. If they're engaged in some bad litigation that's sort of smearing their name publicly, they hire a PM firm. They're not lobbyists, they're not spin doctors. Spin doctors sort of take facts and spin it. Perception managers just take a lie and make it true. And they make you believe. In fact, I read an article by one of the leading perception managers of the day, and it basically said, why in the world would you want to waste time and money trying to discover the truth when it's so easy to create it? And you would be surprised how many people out there sort of live by that, too. And the other point he made was the truth is too unpredictable. It could cut against you, and we can't have that. So it's much better to create it because then you can control it. So anyway, I'm bringing Shaw back, a whole new story, a whole new set of characters alongside of him. And I'm having a lot of fun. I went overseas this summer to research a lot of it. So all the places I write about in this book, I've been to. And while I have not, committed all the acts that Shaw did in the book, there are laws against that, and I'm a law-abiding citizen. I did as much of it as I possibly could. It'll be out in the spring of next year. Don't have a title for it yet. I'm about 3/4 of the way through writing it, and hopefully by the end of the year I'll be done with it. I really appreciate all of you showing up tonight, and let's sign some books.